Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Tales of Home, we retell those moments honest every day, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. My name is Evelyn Hart, and for most of my 67 years, I believed I understood what absence felt like. 8 winters earlier, my husband Robert had stepped into the shower and never stepped out again, his heart switching off as neatly as a light. I learned to measure evenings by the sound of the furnace and the clock in the hallway. I learned to drink 1 cup of tea instead of 2. In Maple Grove, Illinois, routines kept the silence arranged: 3 p.m. kettle on, 3:05 steam fogging the pane over the sink, 3:10 the neighborhood station muttering through a small radio with a bent antenna. That Tuesday, the air felt misbuttoned on the world humid, though the calendar insisted on spring. The radio mentioned cells building southwest, the way a teacher might warn a restless class. I rinsed my cup, set it on the oak table Robert had sanded himself, and told the catless room I'd bring in the potted rosemary before dusk. It was a sentence with no witness, but it steadied my hands. At 3:14, a siren ripped a seam in the day. It was not the tidy test tone of the first Tuesday, but a long grieving wail that made the glass in the cabinets hum. I stood stupidly for a second, watching the sheer curtain lift and fall as if the house were breathing too fast. The radio voice sharpened tornado on the ground. Maple Grove takes shelter. Only then did my body remember itself. In the front room hung a photograph that never failed me. 2 20-somethings at a county fair in 1974, me with bangs I should not have cut, Robert in a Braves cap. Both of us sticky with lemonade and certain about things that had no business being certain. I lifted it down, then put it back. Photographs can be refound. People cannot. I grabbed the canvas tote I used for groceries and filled it with what my hands decided mattered. Robert's old Navy compass, a tin of recipe cards written in my mother's slant, a leather envelope of birth certificates and mortgage papers, and the crocheted throw my neighbor Mrs. Patel had made the winter after Robert died. I slipped his wedding band, the one he wore only on Sundays, onto the chain around my neck. The basement steps were narrow and always wanted another light bulb I never remembered to buy. I took them too fast, feeling the house tighten around me as if it were bracing. The first impact sounded like a truck dropped from the sky, a blunt, impossible thud, then a howl I felt as much in my bones as my ears. Boards complained, nails spoke, the shower of grit from the ceiling tasted like plaster and pennies. I wedged myself into the corner between the water heater and the shelving unit, where I kept jam jars that once held actual jam. The floor shivered. Somewhere above a pane surrendered with a delicate pop. The storm's voice thickened until it was less a sound than an occupation, a freight train that had mistaken my address for a track. I was not brave. I did not speak any noble sentence. I counted 3 slow breaths, then 3 more promising the dark. I would keep counting until the world remembered there was such a thing as stopping. It did stop. Not cleanly, not generously, but the roar lost its teeth and thinned into a complicated hush, full of small, busy noises, shaking metal beads of glass settling into their new lives as the marbles. My knees refused me for a moment. When they relented, I climbed, pushing the basement door with my shoulder. The door opened into a room I recognized only by shape. The roof had been persuaded to leave. The peonies I'd coaxed against the south fence were torn into confetti that would not biodegrade because it was mine. Cabinets had flung their insides into the yard, blue bowls and mud spatulas pretending to be flags. The oak table lay on its side like a toppled animal. Mrs. Patel's fence leaned at an angle more honest than safe. She called my name and I called hers, and for a while that was all conversation meant. People came neighbors, then people who wanted to be helpful, then people whose job it was to organize the helpfulness. A man in a vest asked if I had somewhere to stay tonight. The high school gym had cots set up under the championship banners. There would be soup, he said. The word soup made something inside me buckle. I nodded as one nods in church when one has not heard the prayer. I found my phone under a fallen dictionary W cracked open to weather and pressed the number I knew without looking. It rang twice. Mom Daniel sounded as though I had been scheduled. My son has always been courteous. It is a quality that can pass for kindness. Danny, I said. My voice did a thing on the way out, catching on a burr of dust. The house. I need the simplest words are heaviest in certain hours. A place. A few days. Just until I figure out the insurance. There was a beat long enough to hold impatience without spilling. You're okay, though. I'm standing. I looked up at a strip of sky framed by the absence of a roof. It had the tired color of a bruise. All right, he said, relieved to have an answer he could file. Come into the city. Sloan and I will be home after 6. We'll talk then. It was not the sentence I had wanted, but it was a bridge you could step onto without falling. I told the vested man I had somewhere to go. I signed a paper with a dull pen. I allowed a volunteer with gentle hands to tape a scratch on my forearm and to say in that voice people use for disaster, "You're very brave, ma'am," and I nodded because saying otherwise would require more hours than the day had left. I slept nowhere that night exactly. The gym's lights refused to stay all the way off, and the air had the sweetened smell of mop water. Dawn arrived early wearing the wrong shirt. I borrowed a neighbor's minivan mine had found a tree and lost. We loaded what a life becomes when it is asked to fit 2 trash bags of clothing that still remembered drawers, the canvas tote a box, with the compass clinking against measuring spoons. I tucked Robert's toolbox onto the passenger floor where his shoes should have gone. The highway into Chicago showed no interest in last night's news. The sky performed a cheerful blue. Billboards hoisted impossible smiles for products I could not name. I kept both hands at 10 and 2 and did not allow the thought of the kitchen window to rise. It rose anyway the way morning had used to come through it, stripes on the table, Robert's handscarf from a college bike fall dragging toast through egg yolk. Daniel lived in Streeterville in a building whose lobby smelled like a fragrance counter. A doorman with kind eyebrows looked at the minivan, then at me the way you look at a package whose address has been rubbed nearly off. "Visiting," he asked, and when I said, "My son," his posture agreed to this version of the story. He issued me a temporary badge that swung from a lanyard and felt like a hall pass. The elevator opened onto a floor that resembled a nice hotel from a movie carpet, with no history, a quiet the ears couldn't get purchase on. Daniel opened before I could knock as if he had been standing just behind the peephole practicing. He has Robert's blue eyes, though time and work have schooled what they admit. He kissed my cheek quick and stepped back so the gesture would not become an invitation. "Mom." He set his palm on the door as if scaffolding might be required. Behind him, light slid along polished floors, catching on a slab of stone that served as a dining table. Sloane appeared taut as a bowstring in a cream blouse. She's younger than Daniel and knows her angles. She learns rooms faster than people. "Evelyn," she said the syllables neat. "We heard about Maple Grove. I can't imagine." The door clicked closed behind me. I bent to untie my shoes and saw in the reflection of a column of black glass the way the garbage bags looked collapsed and shiny on their sides. I straightened suddenly, ashamed of their color, as if grief ought to come in matte. I began a meaning conversation that could only be climbed much. A couch would do. Or I would have named the rug if I thought it would keep me. Sloane's smile hovered. "Let's sit," she suggested, as if there were a middle we could occupy. We sat. Daniel angled in a low chair, Sloane on the armrest, me on a sofa so pale I wanted to apologize to it. A sound you could mistake for water was music from a hidden speaker. The city arranged itself through the window silver and certain the lake a suggestion beyond. "The thing is," Daniel began, and he is very good at beginnings that feel responsible this place. He lifted a hand, meaning a square footage he paid for by the hour. "Has been our bubble, our rest. With work the way it is." Sloane supplied the thought he could not afford to own. "We just don't have the setup for long-term guests," she said. "It wouldn't be comfortable for you. There are excellent corporate suites not far, kitchenettes, housekeeping very safe. I can email a list." "Corporate suites," I repeated as if the phrase were a foreign spice, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. "The insurance will come through," Daniel said, eyes bright with solvable math. In the meantime, he reached for his wallet the way a magician reaches for a scarf, ready to produce proof. "We can help you get started?" He slid a few bills across the table. They looked thin on the stone. The thing about being a mother is that you remember your child at so many sizes. Your head is a theater. There was Daniel at 6 refusing mittens because they made him weak. At 13, rinsing a skinned knee under the tap with stoicism so loud it begged applause. At 22, pressed flat by a job he wanted too much. He has always preferred problems that can be spreadsheeted. "Thank you," I said, and made the mistake of hearing myself from outside a woman practicing thank yous, the way other people practice scales. I set the money back on the stone. "I'll manage." Silence can be generous, or it can be a door you realize too late is locked from the other side. This was the second kind. Somewhere in the building, a vacuum started someone else's dust going obediently away. I looked down at my hands, surprised to find they still obeyed me. I stood. "I'll call you Daniel," said relief, already rearranging his face into its natural order. "You always do," I answered, and the sentence was true in 2 directions. Sloane walked me to the door as if the hallway might be difficult to navigate without her. The doorman looked up when I passed, offering a soft nod that felt braver than anyone's words upstairs. Outside, the street glowed with a kind of cleanliness that dissolves footprints before they can turn into evidence. I loaded the bags back into the minivan, one by one, appreciating their dumb willingness to be lifted. It was full dark by the time I reached Lower Columbus, the underside of the city, where deliveries exhale and concrete teaches you about the invention of echo. I parked between a catering van and a sedan with a bumper sticker that had peeled itself away from allegiance. I turned off the engine and listened to nothing for a while. Then I reached for the chain at my throat, feeling the wedding band warm where it rested against my collarbone. In the reflection on the windshield, a woman I recognized stared back, rearranged by brightness into a silhouette, hair pinned in a way that had not invited mirror's coat with a button that had always threatened to leave. I pressed my thumb along the seam of the steering wheel until the seam disappeared under the print. The city above me kept being a city. Sirens' laughter breaks beginnings I could not see. I folded the crocheted throw over my knees and leaned the seat back a notch, not surrendering, not winning, just making room for the fact of the hour. I closed my eyes. The siren from the afternoon still lived under the lid of the day, but it had at last learned to be quiet. The night under Lower Columbus ended the way most hard things end, by becoming a morning. A municipal truck rumbled by and rattled the mirrors. Somewhere above ground, a bus sighed at a stoplight. I sat up stiff as the hinge of an old book and folded the crocheted throw with unnecessary care before tucking it behind the seat. A streak of grime ran along the windshield like a sentence that hadn't learned its period. I drove without deciding to following the undertow of traffic west until the city changed its accent. Concrete uncoiled into smaller streets' corner bakeries opened their doors. A boy on a scooter carved an S across an empty block as if practicing a signature. In Pilsen, I found a church lot with a sign that read, "All are welcome," and decided to trust it. I washed my face in the single-stall bathroom by the fellowship hall, locking the door with a latch as soft as a prayer. The mirror was kinder than the one in the gym. It had been cleaned with a cloth that understood fingerprints. I smoothed my hair into something that suggested intention and buttoned my coat as if the coat were a plan. By noon, the lot had begun to fill with volunteers unloading boxes, canned beans, paper towels, shampoo, and squeeze bottles with cheerful fonts. A woman in a neon vest passed by and offered me a sandwich through the open window. "Turkey," she said, and then, after seeing my face, "Or we can pretend it's whatever you miss." I took the triangle wrapped in wax paper and let it warm my hands before warming anything else. I lasted one more night, their engines murmuring me towards sleep and pulling me back again. The second evening, when the neighborhood began to fold itself away, a man in a pickup idled 2 spaces over and watched nothing in my direction for long enough that I felt watched. I moved on, choosing a Target lot in Berwyn where the lamps were bright and nobody belonged to anybody. The bath of fluorescent daylight in the store's restroom had no patience for illusions. I scrubbed my hands until the paper towels shred like snow and took inventory of myself the way a librarian takes inventory of a shelf that has survived a flood. Steady practical noting what can be salvaged without apology for what can't. I bought a travel-sized toothpaste, a cheap brush, an impulse masquerading as wisdom, a notebook with a red cover. When life is reduced to bags, the square of a notebook feels like architecture. Back in the car, I tried to sleep properly, shoes off, throw tucked, seat reclined, a brave 2 clicks. My back protested. My right hip found the buckle no matter where I put it. I counted lights turning on and off across the street in a bank building with a lobby that had decided it was a museum. I thought of Daniel at 6 again, the sound of his breath when he finally gave into a nap, the damp comma of hair at his temple. Love can be a place you move through with perfect memory and still fail to arrive at any door. At 2:11 a.m., I woke crying, the kind of quiet weeping that tips the body forward, as if the earth had earned you. I pressed my hands to my mouth to keep from making the sort of sound that invites attention. The car was its small universe. The night, its weather. I reached into my purse for a tissue, and because I had been a librarian and librarians have a private gravity that arranges paper to find paper, my fingers found a card wedged under the bottom seam of the lining. It was cream half a shade warmer than bone, the edges worn down by years of being carried in a place I must have called just in case. A name sat on it in a serif that belonged to a different decade, Julian Archer. Beneath Archer Renewal Group, a phone number, a web address I did not trust myself to type on this small, stubborn screen. The back held a note in my handwriting that stopped my breath. "Keep this. He keeps promises." I had written that in a year when I believed sentences could do work for you if you arranged them right. Julian had been the boy with a summer job rehabbing porches for cash, the man who sent a letter from San Luis Obispo on paper that smelled faintly of oranges, the one who asked me to go west and build a life where fog did the kind of work snow did back home. I had not gone. I had chosen steadiness that fit in a ledger and could be balanced. Years later, after Robert was gone and the house echoed like a chapel, I'd watched a local news segment about a firm that specialized in rebuilding after floods and fires. The owner stood with his hands in his pockets while the interviewer spoke. He had less hair and a more deliberate way of speaking, but the posture, the way he listened to the ground as if it could tell the truth, was the same. I had written down the number and then let years stack on top of it like magazines. I held the card to my chest the way girls hold novels they're not finished with and turned it over twice as if it might become instruction. Pride makes a clever case for silence, and loneliness makes a better one for speech. I dialed. The first ring was short, a polite knock. The second rang longer, as if distance had to be included in the price. The line clicked and a voice arrived with the confidence of a tool slid into the right place. Julian Archer. He sounded older, the pitch tempered by time, but the cadence was unmistakable. No introduction to himself. He had become the thing his name promised. I stopped. There is a kind of foolishness you lose with age and a different kind you keep because it knows how to keep you. It's Evelyn Hart. Evelyn. My name in his mouth made the car bigger. He said it like a hand on a railing you'd forgotten was there. I didn't trust myself with the whole story. I didn't trust myself with a portion. I told the part I had to. The storm. Maple Grove. The wrong word tried to climb out homeless, and I pushed it back because I wasn't finished being a home not to myself. I'm in Berwyn in a parking lot. I'll manage, Where exactly? I told him the intersection and the light pole number because the engineers had been kind enough to label it. There was no sound of doubt on the line, no syllable of how or why or after all this time. Stay put, he said. Don't open the door for anyone but me. I'm 28 minutes away. It is a luxury to argue when someone hands you a rope. I hung up and watched my hands shake as though they belonged to a stranger whose body had been asked to do too much, too recently. I sipped the end of a bottle of water that tasted faintly of the trunk, straightened the seat, tucked the throw under my thighs, the way a careful person tucks a child, and waited. He arrived in less than 30, not because he had driven fast in the foolish way, but because there are men who subtract time by aiming it. The SUV that pulled up 2 spaces over was the color of a cloudy coin. He parked so the passenger door of my car was visible to him and stepped out into the light. Silver hair cut close shoulders, carrying what years had given them without apology. If anything about him had surrendered to age, it was the right to hurry. He didn't. He crossed in that quiet, balanced way I had known even when he was 20 and the world thought it would get away with itself. He tapped the glass with 2 knuckles and waited. When I lowered the window, the night air brought his cologne. No, not cologne, just soap and cedar, the dictionary definition of clean. Hi, Evie, he said. No one had called me that in a long time. It did not break me. It put a seam back where a seam had gone missing. He didn't look surprised by how I looked, which is a form of mercy. He didn't make a face that said, poor thing, or what a shame. He looked like a man glad to have found a person he had not been finished finding. Let's get you out of the seat, he said. I got out of the seat. He did not take my elbow, which would have felt like being guided down a church aisle. He opened the back and loaded my bags without flinching at their sound, cotton metal, the hard talk of an object that has been asked to move again. He slid my canvas tote into the front like a passenger, and when the corner of Robert's toolbox bumped his shin, he said, Careful, Captain, with a half smile. I had once promised myself I would not remember this clearly. We didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. The road offered the conversation the way a river offers the shape of a boat. He drove north on Lakeshore, keeping to the middle lane the way long-practiced hands keep to the center of a board. The lake lay off to our right, dark as unlit glass. The city to the left pretended it was noon. I watched the line of his jaw operate in profile and felt none of the panic you're supposed to feel when life asks you to trust your past. When we turned onto the quiet block in Andersonville, the street had the feeling of a musician tuning soft sounds lining up for their job. His house was 2 stories of stone and timber with a porch that had decided long ago to be an invitation. Not a mansion, a place that had kept its promises. He killed the engine and we listened to the car ticking itself cool. Inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell lemon oil and a thread of coffee gone shy. The second was books on built-in shelves that reached the ceiling on the piano's closed lid, on a small table near a window where someone had been interrupted in the exact center of a page. The walls held photos that weren't performative ribbon cuttings in towns amongst with names you could love work crews standing shoulder to shoulder, a line of kindergartners in brand new backpacks. In more than one, Julian was in the back row, not hiding, simply deferring. He carried my bags to a guest room that had not decided it needed to prove anything, a bed whose quilt had been washed enough times to be trusted, a chair that understood backs. He set the canvas tote on the dresser as if he were setting down a sleeping cat. Kitchen, he asked, and when I nodded, he led the way, switching on only the light under the cabinets. The room lit up from the edges like a thing that preferred not to wake people. He handed me a glass of water and then, without comment, put a cast-iron skillet on the stove. He cracked 2 eggs with one hand, a trick that would have irritated me if it belonged to someone else. He toasted bread in the oven the way people who love toast do, laying slices straight on the rack so they grow up to be themselves. I ate standing up at the counter because sitting felt like claiming a place I hadn't earned. I shouldn't have called, I said, and meant it as an apology to the person I had once promised not to pull back into my weather. He wiped a crumb with his thumb as if cleaning evidence, and looked at me as if I were not a case but a person. "You should have called the day you thought of calling," he said. "Not kind, just exact. You're here now. That's the part that exists." The way he arranged sentences had always made me braver inside them. He offered the guest room with a nod and a soft, "Please." I carried my tote coat down the hall with the imposter's caution of a person trying not to breathe on glass. In the mirror above the dresser, the woman who looked back had not improved with proximity, but she had stopped bracing for impact. I slept. Not the sleep that follows pills or exhaustion, but the older kind that houses used to teach firm mattress clean corners the knowledge that doors were behaving themselves. Morning arrived respectfully. Light slid down the wall, paused on the dresser's brass ring, pulls touched the toe of a chair, and made it into a small sun. I found a robe hanging on the back of the door, a neutral gray that made no statement. In the kitchen, coffee announced itself in the old way, and cardinals bickered in the maple outside the window as if the day were theirs by deed. Julian was at the long table with a stack of papers and a pencil. He didn't stand, he didn't need to. "There's cream," he said. "There's also honey if you want to pretend you're doing something different." He poured me a mug and slid it across as if we'd been passing things to each other all our lives. On a corkboard near the pantry hung a map of Cook County dotted with pins and handwritten labels, some in ink, some in pencil. "AR Recovery Phase 2, one card said. "Permit filed. Brighton Park," said another. He followed my gaze. "We do afters," he said. "After fires, after floods, after the universe forgets to be gentle. We help the ground remember where the houses go. We, not I." The old preposition. I nodded, and he kept talking only because he understood that information sometimes makes a safer breakfast than feelings. He showed me the yard, modest hedged with lilacs, a stone path laid like a thought from kitchen to gate. He showed me the library, 2 armchairs that understood the spinal column, a ladder that rolled with its own small thrill, a window seat with a cushion that had forgiven the elbows of readers. He did not show me his bedroom. He did not make a speech about boundaries. He lived inside his habits and let me see what they did. At noon, he left for the office and returned in the evening with the kind of hunger people bring home from honest work. I cooked because the body remembers favorite verbs even when the mind is occupied elsewhere. A chicken with salt and pepper so plain it became itself again. Carrots glazed with the inch of orange juice hiding behind the milk. He ate with the quiet gratitude of a person with parents who had taught him, "You didn't praise dinner, you honored it." After dishes, we sat in the library and read the way strangers read in the same waiting room near each other, not at pages turning at their own responsible pace. He had blueprints. I had a novel I'd once recommended to patrons with a wink that meant "trust me." When I laughed at a line, he looked up in reflex and smiled at the sound, not asking what for. Days made their own polite line. I found a rhythm sweep stew stitch, a loose button walk the block, while the bread cooled on the counter. The house didn't ask me to audition. It gave me chores and accepted the way I did them. In the afternoons, I sat by the window and wrote in the red notebook, not essays, just lists that had faces. Things that were spared compass recipe cards, the little scar above Daniel's eyebrow, things that were not Rosalie Kane's roof, the kitchen clock that ticked even when it wasn't sure. Writing did not repair anything. It acknowledged the room where repairs could begin. Neighbors came in small neighborly ways. Maria Alvarez, who had watered Julian's plants when his work took him out of town, arrived with a pie and the formal announcement that it was too sweet and therefore perfect. Mr. Sato from next door knocked to ask if the maple's lower branches could be thinned, which translated to welcome. I care about how our yards think of each other. No one asked for the story. If they had, I might have told it shorter than it deserved to be told. They asked if I preferred tea or coffee and whether I'd seen the feral black cat that patrolled the garages. I liked them all for those particularities. In the quiet time before dinner, I found photographs of Julian from decades I had missed. In one, he wore a hard hat and a grin beside a foundation that would become 6 apartments. In another, he stood waist-deep in a river, holding a measuring rod, while a woman in waders pointed at the far bank, as if issuing a challenge to erosion. There were thank you cards from school boards and notes from tenants whose handwriting leaned forward with gratitude. On a shelf sat a framed newspaper clipping with a headline that avoided hyperbole, "Local firm to lead West Side rebuild." The picture caught Julian walking away from the camera head, turned to listen to someone outside the frame. The caption did not include his name. I trusted the omission. On the 4th evening after we had folded laundry at the table, the way people do, who've learned cloth is easier when it's warm, he set the last towel on the stack and rested both palms on the wood, as if the grain might confirm something he already knew. "Evji," he said, and stopped not for the drama of it, but to reconsider the shape of the next words. "Stay." It was not a plea. It was not a command. It was the shape of the air between 2 people who had practiced making room for it. I don't want to be a project, I said. I had to say it first, like checking the temperature of water before stepping in. He nodded. You're not a project, you're a person and you're here. Projects have timelines and spreadsheets. People have rooms and afternoons. I could have laughed at that, and almost did. Instead, I looked at his hands, the webbing of sun and work across them, and found my voice unafraid of anything but itself. I don't know who I am in a house that isn't mine. You're the same person you were in the one that was, he said. You make coffee stronger than I do. You put knives in the dish rack pointing down. You hum when you wipe counters. I can list another 6 things, but I won't because I respect both of us. He had noticed my humming. He had always been a man who noticed the verbs and forgave the nouns. He turned, pulled a small box from the sideboard and set it in front of me. Inside lay a key on a plain brass ring. No fob, no flourish, just the tool. I made this yesterday, he said, and the sentence delivered a warmth that felt like a physical object. You can use it or leave it on the counter like a talisman. Either way, the door knows you. I lifted the key and let it weight my palm. Entire lives have pivoted on smaller metal. We ate late that night, then washed plates in a companionable silence that named no ghosts. Before bed, he pointed at the thermostat. If you wake, cold nudge that 2 ticks to the right, he said. No one wins anything by pretending not to be cold. In the guest room, I set the key on the nightstand where the chain with Robert's ring lay coiled. I did not move one toward the other or even compare their shine. I turned off the lamp and lay back. The house breathed around me like a large animal on good terms with you. Somewhere down the hall, water ticked through old pipes, then settled. I watched the ceiling, learn the glow of streetlight, and let my muscles unclench one at a time, the deliberate way you untie a knot when the string matters. In the morning, rain dusted the windows so gently the glass didn't know whether to accept or resist. I pulled on a sweater from the tote, discovered a tear at the cuff, and stitched it while coffee bloomed. My stitches were uneven. I wore the sweater anyway, admiring the imperfection the way you admire a child's drawing of a house that has too many windows, because the child believes in light. Julian returned from a site visit with mud on his boots and the good mood that follows a day when the materials recognize you. He shook off his coat, leaned against the counter, and looked at me as if measuring how a room had learned me. How was your day, he asked. It is the plainest sentence people send each other, and still the most serviceable. I mended, I said. A small thing. It mended me back. He poured 2 mugs and slid mine across. His hand stopped halfway and hovered, an old habit of asking before taking. Evi. Yes. Would you ever consider making this not temporary? He didn't say forever. He didn't say arrangement. He didn't add conditions or explanations. He left the question whole, and by leaving it whole made it kinder. I didn't answer then. Words should be clean before they're spoken, and mine had been through a storm. I set my palm on the red notebook and felt the cover's faint tooth under my skin, as if it had been designed to catch ink and caution both. I looked at the key on the hook near the door. I looked at Julian's boots drying on the mat, their salt rings fading like a shoreline after tide. The house sounded like a house. My body, for the first time in a week, forgot to brace. Let's have dinner, I said. And we did soup from a chicken that had been something else the day before, bread that sang when the knife went through its crust. We ate and didn't discuss anything in capitals, and after he put a record on the turntable he'd found at a yard sale in Evanston from a man who swore vinyl made the world hold still. It didn't. It made it steady enough to sit inside. When I turned off the light in the guest room, the key on the nightstand reflected a small coin of streetlight and kept that coin all to itself. The rain slowed. The maples outside lifted their leaves, pleased to be relieved of the chore of catching water. I slept the way houses teach sleep to those who've decided to be inside them. The call came in the late morning while a pot of lentils sizzled softly where they kissed the edge of a simmer. The number on the screen was Daniel's, the name arranged in tidy letters as if they could sort the hour. I let it ring twice before swiping the small delay a courtesy to myself. Mom, he said, voice level. I've been trying to reach you. I'm here, I said, and realized the sentence had stopped meaning only geography. Where is here? At a friend's. A friend. A pause, not quite suspicion, not yet comfort. Mrs. Patterson told me you weren't in the extended stay anymore. I'm not. I watched rain peck the side window, not impatient, just correct. I'm safe. I'm useful. He let that sit. Sloan thinks we should talk, he said. About everything. Everything is a large word people use when they prefer not to list. I stirred the lentils until the bubbles agreed to mind themselves. All right. Tonight, he asked, dinner. I heard Sloan in the background, her syllables drafted into advisement. I thought of the key on the hook of Julian's boots drying by the door. Yes, I said. 7. I told Julian when he came in the smell of damp wool riding ahead of him. He set his briefcase by the sideboard, unbuttoned his coat, and listened without interrupting. We'll make a good meal, he said simply, and went to wash his hands. We did not dress the house for inspection. We wiped the table as we always wiped it. I put rosemary under a chicken. He quartered potatoes with a competence that suggested respectful marriages with ovens in his past. At 6:50, I changed my shirt for one without flour near the hem and placed 3 plates on the table, then paused and set a 4th. When the bell chimed 7 on the little clock that kept our kitchen honest, the doorbell echoed it. Daniel stood there in a slate suit that deserved a meeting, not a dinner. Sloan in black hair pinned so finely that a bobby pin would have been an insult. She held a gift bag with tissue that attempted levitation. "Mom," Daniel said, and leaned in to kiss my cheek. His mouth brushed the air. Sloan offered the bag, her smile tuned to the correct wattage. "Candles," she said. "Cedar and something unpronounceable. Thought they might make any place feel like home." "Thank you," I said, because I was raised to hand that word over even when it weighed more than it should. Julian came from the kitchen, drying his hands on a towel. He did not offer a handshake first. He offered his name, Julian Archer. "Daniel Hart," my son said, measuring. "This is my wife, Sloan." They exchanged the sort of nod people use on executive floors. The kitchen absorbed their reflections calmly. Julian gestured toward the table. "Please," he said, and the single syllable found chairs for them without effort. I poured water. Daniel looked around with discretion, his gaze accepting the wooden beams, the modest frame photographs, the absence of art that announced itself. Sloan complimented the smell of dinner. I said it was mostly the oven doing what ovens do if you ask politely. We ate. The knife sounded right against the plates. Daniel praised the potatoes. Sloan mentioned a friend in development whose firm had been watching Archer's work for years, and turned the sentence so lightly that it landed as a bouquet instead of reconnaissance. Real estate must be absorbing. Daniel tried always careful with adjectives that might suggest appetite. I work with insurance portfolios, risk profiles, loss mitigation. There's some daylight between what we do, but sometimes daylight is where the bridge goes. Julian nodded, once interested without being indebted. "We're in the business of afters," he said. "After a fire, after a storm." "Important work," Daniel said. "Demand must be consistent." "Unfortunately," Julian said, and let the word remain what it was. Sloan set down her fork with a small theatrical absence. "We're so glad Mom has somewhere calm," she said, pivot liquid. "The city can be intense." "We were..." She glanced at Daniel. "We were worried. There are statements that arrive too late to pay what they owe." I folded my napkin and unfolded it, an old habit of keeping my hands busy while my mouth learned where the truth would exit. I said not to prosecute, simply to place a fact on the table among the utensils. That night, Daniel looked at his water. "We didn't understand," he said. "Everything moved quickly." "The weather did," I agreed. Silence took a turn around the table and returned well-behaved. Julian cleared plates with the generosity of a man who knows transitions are easier when hands have work. He brought pears baked with a single square of chocolate lodged in their caves and set them down without flourish. Sloane's smile brightened by a watt. "This place is lovely," she said. The pause calculated, not deceitful. "How long have you lived here?" "Long enough to know where the good screws are in the walls," Julian said. "Short enough that the neighbors still correct my garbage day." "That map," Daniel said, nodding toward the corkboard. Ambitious. His appetite for nouns hovered near the pins. "You're leading phase 2 on the west side, rebuild. We're coordinating permits with the city and trying not to get in the way of people who already know what they need," Julian said. "Funding channels must be complicated." Daniel charmed a bite of pear into harmlessness. Different streams at different temperatures. Julian held his coffee with 2 hands, the way people do when they want the mug to keep them in the right place. Sometimes the money is the simplest part. Sloan edged her plate slightly away from the fork as if to give it room to consider seconds. "I imagine there's oversight." "There is," Julian said, "and communities who insist on remembering themselves. We moved to the library because the chairs in there know how to demonstrate hospitality." Sloan took in the built-ins with polite awe, the latter with the kind of interest that becomes a social media post later. Daniel hovered near the photographs. His eyes paused on a ribbon cutting where Julian off-center was laughing at something a child had said. I took the red notebook from the window seat and set it under a magazine as if it preferred not to be seen working. When we were all seated, Julian rested his elbows lightly on his knees, hands laced posture, both informal and precise. He waited until the room had resigned itself to listening. "I want to talk about Evelyn," he said. Daniel's face did a small thing it hated being caught doing. "All right." "The night after the storm," Julian went on, not raising his voice, not lowering it, "she called you. She was frightened and exhausted and asked for a couch. If you tell me you had a reason, I'm sure you did. Reason is easy to come by, but the facts remain." Sloane's smile deserted her for the first time. The bare bones of her concern showed through. "We panicked," she said quickly. "Our place isn't suitable. We thought a hotel would be more comfortable." Daniel finished, grateful for the handoff. "We misjudged." Julian looked at him, not unkindly. She slept in her car, he said, twice. There is no math that balances that. Daniel swallowed. His Adam's apple had kept its adolescent sense of drama. We're trying to make it right, he said. We asked you to dinner. He glanced at the corkboard again. The pins gleamed like small indictments. We care about Mom. We care about where she is. We wanted to meet the man she's with. You're meeting him, Julian said. I am a person, not a ledger. My work is not an extension of your curiosity, and your curiosity is not a substitute for love. Sloane's mouth parted. A well-prepared line lost its coordinates and never arrived. Daniel's gaze flashed hurt, hardening to something sharper. Are you implying we're here for... He gestured, needing a word he could dislike. For assets. Julian tipped his head. I'm saying you've asked me about my projects before you asked your mother about her sleep. The sentence landed gently and still found its mark. Daniel looked at me, then not in the way of little boy Daniel or even job interview Daniel, but as if trying to decide a pronoun. Mom, he said, we want you to come stay. We were wrong. Come home. Home, that chameleon. I had the good sense not to chase it. When I needed you most, you wanted me elsewhere, I said. Speaking it did not make me a hero. It made me accurate. I drove away from your lobby with garbage bags and slept under bridges designed for deliveries. I will not pretend that didn't happen. Sloane lifted her hands, palms up. We made a mistake, she said. The word was so polished it reflected the ceiling. Let us correct it. Julian leaned back. The chair received the shift and kept its counsel. You don't correct a night someone lived, he said. You apologize for it. The two are not the same. Daniel's jaw tightened and then loosened like a door trying to remember which way it swings. I'm sorry, he said to me. He said it like a person producing a document. For that night, for the hotel suggestion, for not coming down to the car with you and seeing what a parking lot looks like at 2 a.m. I let the picture have the room, then I nodded. Not a pardon, a true response, thank you. The library absorbed silence the way good wood absorbs oil. It shone a little under the weight. Sloane stood, then seemed surprised to find herself a vertical. We should go, she said too brightly. We don't want to take your evening. Julian stood as well, and so did Daniel, because he is a man who knows how chairs and men communicate. At the door, Sloane pressed the candles into my hands again, as if weight needed to be reassigned. Daniel put a palm against the jamb, then took it away, unfamiliar with the impulse. On the porch, the night air had cooled into a politeness that knew the lake by first name. Daniel lingered the way sons do when their words have run out, but their wanting hasn't. Mom, he said softer, if you need anything, I know the number I said. He nodded, the motion small. Sloane's heels found the rhythm of the walk. They crossed the gate and turned left. Daniel followed. At the curb, his anger at himself the evening the architecture of the past looked for a thing to put itself in and settled for his pockets. Inside, Julian closed the door with that attentive care he pays to all closings. We cleared the cups. The house returned to its ordinary arrangement as if restoring a painting to its everyday wall. The candles stood on the counter unopened, exerting their cedar and unpronounceable potential. I set them in a drawer where matches live and shut the drawer quietly, so nothing inside would be startled. Later in the library, I took the red notebook from under the magazine and wrote a list under a fresh date, things said out loud. Sometimes precision is the only shelter available. I wrote the sentence about the car, and the sentence about the couch, and the sentence Julian had offered that separated apology from correction. The page felt heavier afterward, the way a coat gains weight in the rain, and then promises warmth once you step back inside. When I turned out the lamp, the window held a square of night in which the maple's leaves moved without drama. Somewhere in the house, the fridge murmured its commitment to continuity. I slid the notebook back into its place and went to the hallway where the small hook near the door waited. The key hung there, catching a blade of streetlight. I touched it with one finger, not as ceremony, simply to prove to my hand what my mind had decided to accept the door, and I recognized each other. In the morning, a square of sunlight slid across the kitchen floor and stopped at the toe of the sideboard, as if it had reached an agreed border. I poured coffee and opened the red notebook to yesterday's page. Before I found a pen, my phone chimed. The subject line wore the city's tone, redevelopment notice, Maple Grove priority return. The email came from the County Land Trust. The language was formal, the kind that earns its periods program approved priority granted to displaced residents administrator Archer Renewal Group. A paragraph near the end named blocks and lots I knew by muscle memory. A line under that stated what no line had ever stated to me in writing. Existing residents retain right to return at stabilized rates. Assistance assigned. I read it twice, not for meaning but for gravity. Julian came in from the yard with a leaf caught on his sleeve. He set it on the counter like a paper crane and rinsed his hands. I turned the screen toward him. He nodded once and poured himself the coffee he didn't yet drink. You didn't tell me, I said, not accusation, simply air moved across a fact. We won the bid last month, he said. It cleared committee yesterday. I waited for the email to have your name on it. The kettle clicked off behind him. He didn't turn. In the quiet, the word return had a weight I could rest my hand on. I closed the phone and put it face down on the table. We ate toast without ceremony. Between us, the leaf dried into the shape it had chosen overnight. Spring decided itself stubbornly that week. The lake threw back more light than it borrowed. Crews on Julian's sites began to speak a language of tape measures and chalk lines that anyone could understand if they stood still long enough. I did what days asked, swept, watered, answered the door when neighbors returned pie plates, stitched the seam in a pillowcase, whose future depended on a patient needle. At night we read. Sometimes the record player turned on for a side and forgot to be turned over. We let it forget. When the letter from the land trust followed the email paper embossed, seal my name, I laid it in the top drawer of the dresser and closed the drawer gently so the news wouldn't jostle. That evening when Julian came in with sawdust in the cuff of his jeans, I handed him the envelope so he could feel the paper too. He did, then put it back in my palm with a look that said the paper belonged to me. The wedding was not arranged so much as permitted. October made a clear day and set it on the table. We carried chairs to the yard and aligned them with the maple's shadow. Maria Alvarez brought a cake that leaned a little to the left and insisted on wearing the roses exactly where they pleased. Mr. Sato arrived with a camera older than most of the guests and wore it like an uncle. A minister who had known Julian since a year with different gasoline prices said the words a minister says when two people decide the same door is theirs. I wore a navy dress that had been waiting at the back of a closet I no longer owned. Julian wore a suit the color of clean slate. When we stood across from each other, the house arranged itself around the moment, the porch a witness, the kitchen a patient accomplice, the maple practicing applause. His hands were warm when he took mine. The ring slid on as if it had been practicing without us. Daniel came alone. He stood near the gate at first as if testing a shoreline. During the photos, he moved closer, then closer again, until we were sharing shade. After the vows, he approached with a posture that had not decided whether to be formal. "Congratulations," he said to Julian, and then to me, quieter. "You look right." "Thank you," I said. The word weighed what it needed to and nothing more. He didn't reach for my hand. He seemed to remember my hands already had a job. "I'm sorry," he added the 3 syllables finally shaped by his own mouth rather than delivered by a meeting. For the lobby. For the couch that wasn't a couch. For knowing how to define risk and not knowing how to see it. "I heard you," I said. Hearing and accepting are separate tasks. The day required only the first and perhaps a part of the second. His shoulders lowered a fraction, relieved to be given an assignment he could keep. People ate cake. The knife slid through frosting with a sound like soft applause. Someone started a song on a speaker that had traveled in a tote bag and didn't mind duties above its pay grade. We toasted with iced both with iced tea in cups that pretended to be glass. When the sun adjusted its angle, the maple's shadow shifted our aisle to the left, and no one objected. Later, when the last plate found its way to the sink and the yard resumed being a yard, Julian and I sat on the steps with our shoes off and the door open behind us. A breeze came through the house long enough to gather a thread of lemon oil and carry it past. I leaned against his shoulder because the step had decided not to be comfortable, and because the shoulder had decided to be. In the half-light, the ring on my hand looked like a small moon content with one phase. Inside on the hall hook, the key stayed where it knew to stay. In the drawer, the letter rested with its seal unbroken a second time. Out on the lake, a late boat stitched a white line into water that accepted it and then forgot. The maple exhaled. The porch released the heat it had borrowed all afternoon, plank by plank. We stayed until the yard and the street and then the sky retired in their separate orders, and when we went in, the door received us as if that had always been its work. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.